Let's talk now about Garry Winogrand's photography. So he was born in the 20s, lived right up until the mid 80s. As a street photographer, he was somewhat obsessive. He was always photographing and amassed an enormous quantity of negatives and prints that he just was hopeless with editing. He didn't want to do it. He always needed outside help to edit his work. And so he amassed this enormous body of work that was completely disorganized. He left thousands of disorganized photos at the time of his death. In fact, it was just a couple of years ago that they published a documentary about his work that reflected that they're still trying to sort through all the stuff that he left behind. He published three books during his lifetime, including the titles "The Animals," "Public Relations," and "Women Are Beautiful." He was widely exhibited in the 1970s. Was very popular in his time. He saw himself as carrying forward the sort of torch of photography from Walker Evans to Robert Frank. So Walker Evans published American Photographs, way back in the 1930s. Robert Frank's The Americans in the 1950s. Another generation later, we have Garry Winogrand. So he sees himself very much carrying on their legacy and updating it to reflect the realities of the time that he's living in. So this is the kind of photography that Gary Winogrand is best known for. So it's street photography of people. You can see that he's particularly interested in pretty girls and in photographing women and in the sort of interactions between people. Captured most of the time unawares. So really different from what Diane Arbus is doing, where she's trying to create a connection between the viewer and the subject of the photograph. Gary Winogrand is really much more of a spy. He's just sort of like capturing things as he goes by, shooting really fast, and then we end up with these sort of perfect moments of they're complicated. They're not these sort of perfectly structured compositions like you would get in a great Henri Cartier-Bresson photograph. They're very, much more messy, but they have a lot to do with the social world and interactions between people that reflect the social phenomena, the things that are going on in their world at the time. It was said by Winogrand's later editor about his work: one side is a great exuberant warmth, a love of the plebeian energy of American life, and the other side is a persistent despair that it's all out of control and that it will end up badly. The two are so well to do each other that in any one of the best photos, you don't know whether to feel elated or horrified, and you feel both. So these photographs capture elements of connection between people that sometimes you don't know exactly how to feel about them. This brings us to The Animals, a collection of photographs that he made at the Central Park Zoo in New York City in the early 1960s. The kind of sense of humor that he brings to the way that he captures his subjects in pairings between humans and animals. Sometimes that sense of humor seems kind of mean-spirited, sometimes it seems kind of nasty. But then the funny thing about photography and street photography is that he's not making up these moments. He's framing them and he's capturing them, and they sometimes seem to be suggesting relationships that may or may not be an accurate reflection of reality, and yet, they sort of open themselves up to interpretation that way. And that's the context for this photograph from the book called The Animals. A young interracial couple is featured in this photograph, and they are holding a pair of chimps that are dressed like human children. When you see this photograph for the first time, it can take you a little while to register exactly what it is that you're seeing, because at first glance you might not even, catch the reality that they're actually holding two animals and not human beings because they're dressed in kids' clothing. It's strange but true. It was actually a real thing that was going on at that period in time in New York City. It was sort of a high class thing to do to purchase exotic pets and keep them in the city. So people had, animals that are no longer legal to keep as pets during that time. And at the same time, it was also a time in experimentation in linguistics and in psychology, that people were trying to understand just what makes primate psychology, the psychology of humans, different from the psychology of other primates. And so there was a lot of experimentation with actually literally raising chimps and other primates in human families, and trying to see how much their sort of social surroundings might be allowing them to learn human habits and human traits. Anyways, that's all background context for how this is even possible to capture a photograph like this. The implications of the photograph are troubling, and it's a hard photograph to look at from a contemporary perspective. But it's one of these things that we just have to deal with the legacy of this medium as we have inherited it. It's part of the way that photographers made their work in the 1960s, that they presented themselves as objective, but then they make these photographs that come from a personal sort of sensitivity, and that they become part of a bigger discussion that they are somehow able to absolve themselves of responsibility for. This ability to sort of just like put things in front of you, but then the photographer absolving themselves of judgment is sort of the attitude that Winogrand takes in photographing women as well. So he photographed women a lot, and this is the kind of photograph that he's known for. It seems just sort of like this radiant celebration of the beauty of these young women. They seem kind of these otherworldly figures walking down the street with this angelic glow and rays of light all around them, while there's a young man in a wheelchair just sort of collapsed on himself over on the left, and a young boy over on the right whose sight line crosses over to where the man is in the wheelchair. It doesn't make an argument like the photograph of the interracial couple doesn't make an argument, but it sort of it opens itself up to a certain kind of reading that can be kind of disturbing. But again, we're looking back at the people who were celebrated in their time. We look differently at this material now, I think. Well, this brings us to Lee Friedlander. So Friedlander was a contemporary of Garry Winogrand, and they had many things in common. They gravitated towards similar subject material, and at first glance, actually, it may be difficult to tell the two of them apart. They had a lot in common, but there's some things that differentiate them. So we'll look at that. So both of them had a street photography with a sense of ironic detachment from social interaction. Lee Friedlander, though, had a formalist eye for multiple intersecting planes of space. So he's kind of more a formalist than Garry Winogrand was, and sometimes worked a little bit more slowly. You can tell he's really visually constructing his scenes. His photographs frequently include his own shadow that became a sort of uh, stylistic signature, in his photographs. There were lots of photographs of passing women, often with his shadow falling on them. And he had a long interest in photographs from car windows. So this is kind of a classic Lee Friedlander photograph here. You can see that he's captured his shadow in reflection in a window. If you're looking at all the different levels of planes of space, you see our point of view, which is the photographer's point of view, since he's taking his own photograph. He's framed it so that this picture that's taped up behind the window is sort of it's lined up very close to where the camera is that he's holding. Behind him, you see this street scene with a car and more windows back there. But look at all of the overlapping reflections and layers of rectangles. It's a composition that is just like interesting to look at and visually sort through and kind of move back and forth in greater and lesser depth. So you have that sense of greater and lesser depth, closer and further away in his approach to people in street scenes as well. Not really a sense of interacting with his subjects. Here, his subject is completely has her back turned to us, but there his shadow is falling very, very close on her. So the Friedlander's shadow shows up in a photograph like this one too. He's not quite as close to his subjects, but again, you see women with their backs turned to him, which it's not a little unsettling. It seems a little predatory in the way that he's sort of like creeping up on people and taking their photographs unawares. The way that he's broken up the space with lines and shapes seems to be something that really interests him in his compositions. Here's one of his photographs using that sort of layered approach to space and car windows. So, the great American road trip, the sense of getting out there into the world, capturing the sense of freedom that the car gives you in this time in the 1960s. That's part of the spirit of his photography, too. And here's a classic Lee Friedlander photograph, and this one's from 1972. This one you can see it was set up with tremendous care. Look at the angles that he's created. The lines don't seem bent or distorted by the way that he's using his lens. Okay, it seems like everything is lined up very carefully, and that reflects the strategy that he's taken as a photographer. He's not just like shooting fast, like pointing this way and pointing that way as would say a Robert Frank. Okay, when Robert Frank is out photographing streets and cars and dogs and streetlights and things that you see in here, with Robert Frank, you would get a sense that he's moving all the time and just capturing the life that's going on around him. Friedlander is standing very still and he's lining things up very carefully. And here, I mean, what we're actually seeing in the photograph, it seems almost like a background. It seems like there's like nothing going on in there. There's a fire hydrant, there are the fronts of cars, there's this sort of nondescript house across the street, a few trees and some scrubby grass, and a dog that seems to be waiting its turn to cross the street. Why is the dog there all by itself? Little things like that. It's a moment, it's a way that a place looks in time, and it's a composition of very commonplace things that you would see without really paying much attention to them.